worship associate today. I'm a longtime member of this church. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you today, along with our regular minister, the Reverend Sean Wiltshire, our Director of Music Ministries, Beth Syverson, and our Acting Director of Religious Education, Randy Kokel. Before I continue, let me please remind you to silence your cell phones. Thank you. You're also invited, if you have one, to turn your hearing aid over to receive sound from our T-coil. As Unitarian Universalists, our spiritual paths vary, but in this congregation we have a covenant that wherever our paths may lead, we will walk them together. We affirm that all life has value, inherent value. All existence is interconnected, and we strive for justice and compassion in our deeds and relationships. We're committed to creating a welcoming community without regard for the traits that sometimes divide people. Want to extend a special welcome to visitors this morning. I see a couple right here. If you are seeking a spiritual home, we hope you will find it here. More of what you need to follow the service will be on the screen in front of you. Then our worship begins with the lighting of our chalice as we say our unison affirmation.
Love is the spirit of the church, and service is its law. To dwell together in peace, to seek truth and love, and to help one another. This we affirm together.
Good morning, and give a welcome to U3, which stands for Unitarian Universalist Ukulele. Today we are celebrating Martin Luther King Jr. Day, and I like to think of it as our High Holy Day. So I put together a lot of music for this morning with the U3 and the choir and several soloists are going to sing today in honor of this special day.
What can one little person do? What can one little me or you do? What can one little person do to help this world go round? One can help another one, and together we can get the job done. What can one little person do to help this world?
Harriet Tubman was alone on the darkened road to freedom, but she couldn't leave her people far behind. Moses stretched out her hand, she led them to promised land, 'cause she knew that she had justice on her side.
What can one little person do? What can one little me or you do? What can one little person do to help this world go around? One can help another one, and together we can get the job done. What can one little person do to help this world?
When Sojourner Truth was free, she got down on her knees, prayed to God to help her on the way. With her voice and her mind, she fought for what was right, 'cause she knew she had justice on her side.
What can one little person do? What can one little me or you do? What can one little person do to help this world go round? One can help another one, and together we can get the job done. What can one little person do to help this world?
Rosa Parks sat on a bus, and the driver said, "You must told the world I haven't. He led this country's fight for human rights. We must fight for liberty until all of us are free. To know we have justice on our side.
What can one little person do? What can one little me or you do? What can one little person do to help this world go round? One can help another one, and together you get the job done. What can one little person do to help this world? One can help another one, and together we can get the job done. What can one little person do to help this world?
This morning I have a responsive reading for you. I invite you to join me on the italicized portions. I'll begin. This is where we are.
Where do we go from here?
First, we must massively assert our dignity and worth.
We must stand up against a system that still oppresses and develop an unassailable and majestic sense of values.
What is needed is a realization that power without love is reckless and abusive.
And that love without power is sentimental and anemic.
Power at its best is love implementing the demands of justice.
And justice at its best is power correcting everything that stands against love.
And this is what we must see as we move on.
Amen.
Even dreams fall apart.
work in the rain. Oh, we gotta learn to work in the rain. Down to work in the rain.
Now is that story time, the time for all ages, and children at heart are welcome to join me up here as we tell a story. Many of you know this story, the story of Ruby Bridges. Hey guys, woohoo, we got a couple, awesome. Everybody else must be in our religious education class. Good to see you guys. All right, so Ruby Bridges was about 6 years old, and back when she was 6 years old, unfortunately, our schools in this area of the country were segregated. In other words, you have people with dark skin in one and other people in light skin in another, and that was wrong. So the government decided to change that and wanted to integrate all of the schools, right? And they asked Ruby Bridges' parents, would you be willing for Ruby to be one of the first black children to go to an all-white school? Boy, they really struggled with that decision. They prayed on it, they went to their church, and ultimately decided, yes, okay, Ruby would be one, because they knew that poor Ruby, people would take it out on her when all she wanted to do was have an education. So on Ruby's very first day of school, it was a little bit atypical than most people's first day of school, right? Some U.S. Marshals show up at her door, and they say, we're going to walk you to school. U.S. Marshals are kind of like national police officers. Now, that was sort of strange enough, but so she walks off to school and goes to school. You can see her going to school up here with the U.S. Marshals around her. Only on the other side of the street was a bunch of yelling people holding up terrible signs, telling her to go home, telling her they didn't want her here. Can you imagine being 6 years old and having all of these adults yelling at you? It'd be pretty horrific. But every day, Ruby would do this. On her first day, she met Miss Barbara Henry. That was her teacher. When she walked into the classroom, it was completely empty except for Miss Henry, because none of the parents would allow their students to be taught with Ruby. But Miss Henry said, Ruby, please come on in. Please choose a seat. And Ruby sat in the very front of the class. And Miss Henry began to teach her. And they developed this wonderful friendship, because this happened every single day. Ruby would walk to school with the marshals, the crowd yelling at her every single Monday through Friday. And she would come and sit in Miss Henry, and Miss Henry would teach her alphabet and all the things that you do when you're in first grade. Well, one day, Miss Henry was at the classroom window looking out, and she saw little Ruby coming down the street with the U.S. Marshals, and sure enough, there's the crowd of people yelling at her, kind of crowding even near her. And suddenly Ruby stops. And she bows her head. And the U.S. Marshals are trying to urge her forward, but she won't. She stands there. And she could see, Miss Henry could see her lips moving. Like, oh, Ruby was told never to talk to the crowd, never to talk to anybody. So when finally Ruby came forward and she walked into the classroom, Miss Henry said, Miss Henry said to Ruby, what did you say to them? You know, you're not supposed to do that. She said, oh, well, you see, normally before I go to school, I pray on my way to school, but I forgot to say my prayers, so I stopped to say my prayers. Miss Henry said, well, Ruby, what did you pray? Ruby said this, please, God, try to forgive those, because even if they say those bad things, they don't know what they're doing. So you could forgive them just like you forgave those folks when they said those terrible things about you. Not long after that, the crowds disappeared. And in her second year of school, it was fully integrated. And that is our story for today. Let's sing our children out to the religious education classes. Thanks for coming, guys.
We hold you in our love as you go.
1957, it was about a year after the Montgomery bus boycott, which is what launched Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference into sort of national prominence. So about a year after that it happened, Martin Luther King was addressing a bunch of eager activists from the YMCA and the YWCA in Berkeley, California. And he was trying to explain to them nonviolence and how he and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference had taught nonviolent resistance to the Montgomery community during the boycott. This is what he had to say about this. One thing that we had to get over was the fact that the nonviolent resistor does not seek to humiliate or defeat the opponent, but to win his friendship and understanding. This was always a cry that we had to set before people, that our aim is not to defeat the white community, not to humiliate the white community, but to win the friendship of all of the persons who had perpetrated this system in the past. The end of violence, or the aftermath of violence, is bitterness. The aftermath of nonviolence is reconciliation and the creation of the beloved community. A boycott is never an end within itself. It is merely a means to awaken a sense of shame within the oppressor. But the end is reconciliation. The end is redemption. Then we had to make it clear also that the nonviolent resistor seeks to attack the evil system rather than individuals who happen to be caught up in the system. And this is why I say from time to time that the struggle in the South is not so much the tension between white people and Negro people. The struggle is rather between justice and injustice, between the forces of light and the forces of darkness. And if there is a victory, it will not be a victory merely for 50,000 Negroes, but it will be a victory for justice, a victory for goodwill, a victory for democracy. Another basic thing we had to get over is that nonviolent resistance is also an internal matter. It not only avoids external violence or external physical violence, but also internal violence of spirit. And so at the center of our movement stood the philosophy of love, the attitude that the only way to ultimately change humanity and make the society that we all long for is to keep love at the center of our lives. In a spirit of meditation this morning, I invite you to consider these words and maybe ask yourself, what does he mean by keeping love at the center of our lives? The only way to ultimately change humanity and make the society that we all long for is to keep love at the center of our lives.
Amy and Susan are going to lead us in a song called Far Too Long. It's a very new song and very relevant to what's going on today.
Somebody's hurting my country, and it's gone on far too long. Yes, it's gone on far too long. Yes, it's gone on far too long. Yes, somebody's hurting my country, and it's gone on far too long. And I won't be silent anymore, no more. Somebody's hurting my neighbors, and it's gone on far too long. Yes, it's gone on far too long. Oh, it's gone on far too long. Somebody's hurting my neighbors, and it's gone on far too long. And I won't be silent anymore.
You know, if there's anyone in this country who is said to have spoken truth to power, it would be the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He called out white supremacy, racism, militarism in this country, and he changed it forever. You know, and the powers that be tried to imprison him, bomb him, shut him up, shut him down, and while eventually someone did kill him, to this day his dream and his vision live on. And you know, what King and the Civil Rights Movement did, it was so unbelievable, it was so astounding, we still study it today. He led this nonviolent resistance against an overwhelmingly racist culture and got it to move in the opposite direction. I mean, it's really tremendous. I mean, how in the world did he do this? And this is what has fascinated people from around the world who have studied him. So I'm going to kind of break it down for you, or rather it's the King Center who's broken it down for us. Because King had 6 principles that he lived by. Principles, sounds familiar, right? We've got 7 of them, he had 6. Let's see here. So, these were the foundation for his nonviolent resistance, his principles of nonviolence. So the very first one is this. Nonviolence is a way of life for courageous people. Now he knew that not everybody could do this. And in fact, he told people, if you cannot do this, don't show up to the marches, don't show up. Not everybody can do it. When he trained people, he wasn't looking for people to just come and do one sit-in and but to always be engaged and active. Always have that active mind that was always seeking to persuade and encourage something different. The second thing was nonviolence seeks to win friendship and understanding. He believed that the end result of nonviolence was reconciliation and the creation of a beloved community. As we heard in our reading, it was not to humiliate, right, or belittle the opponent. How can you have reconciliation if you've been humiliating someone? Number 3, nonviolence seeks to defeat injustice, not people. As he said also in our reading, nonviolence holds that evildoers are also victims. Think about that. Think about people that you think are evildoers who are not acting in accordance with the values of the United States, and think about them as victims. Number 4, nonviolence holds that voluntary suffering can educate and reform. Now, this one made me twitch a little bit. This idea that suffering, right, can educate and transform, in part because King was a liberation theologist, and liberation theology holds that the suffering of Christ is what redeems the world. And this has been used as an excuse, in particular, for women to stay with abusive spouses, or any spouse to stay with an abusive spouse, because that suffering is redemptive. But there's a key word in here, and that word is voluntary, right? Now, you remember images like this of protesters sitting at a cafe, at a segregated cafe, and having hot coffee poured on them, and salt and sugar poured all over them.
Cigarettes dropped down.
Cigarettes put out. And horrible things. This is the type of voluntary suffering he was talking about, because these are the pictures that changed the world, that changed people's minds. In fact, King went so far as to start what was called the Children's Crusade. In 1963, the Children's Crusade, he allowed children to be recruited from our, not little ones, but like middle school, high school kids, and included them in marches. So that you had pictures like this of these fire hoses. Now this might look like a nice frame, but when you've ever had a fire hose posed on you, it can rip your clothing off. They had dogs set on these kids. And this outraged people. It touched the hearts and minds of people to see children treated this way. And King was highly criticized for recruiting these school-aged youths. Most of these kids were there against their parents' permission. King believed that when reason fails, suffering can convert the enemy. and it worked. The last two of his principles. The fifth is nonviolence chooses love instead of hate. It knows that love may be returned with hostility and hate, and that love is active, not passive, right? It's not about shutting up and being nice. It's saying hard words with love. Nonviolent love does not sink to the level of the hater. Nonviolent love does not sink to the level of the hater. Nonviolent love recognizes that all life is interconnected and it restores communities. And number 6, that nonviolence believes that the universe is on the side of justice. There's a clear theological statement that this universe does bend toward justice, and it will eventually win. Now, these principles informed everything he did and how it went about this, and about how he went around this nonviolent resistance. And from these principles, then, he created the tools and steps that people take. So these are his 6 steps of nonviolence. The first step, if you've got something going wrong in your community, is you gather information. You learn about the issue from all people involved in it. Second thing, you educate others. You help those around you understand and invite those who are particularly affected into the conversation. You have to remain committed because a lot of this work is not sexy. It's really hard and difficult, and we have to support one another. You peacefully negotiate. You talk to both sides. You use humor, intelligence, and grace to find solutions for the greater good. Then you take action peacefully. Only after you have done all of these things do you then take action, whether it's a demonstration or letter writing or petitions or sit-ins or whatever it is, a boycott. And number 6, people forget the 6th step. You keep being peaceful and in conversation and encouraging the change that you see. So what's amazing to me is that everyone loves King, right? You see, what he did was one of the most effective campaigns for cultural change in the history of the world, and yet we don't usually follow all of these steps. We skip 1 through 4, we go directly to 5, and we don't even think about 6. Most people just want to go out and protest without any of the other steps out there. We don't live the principles. We belittle and we humiliate people. People, not systems. We don't have the compassion or see the evildoers as victims. Instead, we vilify and shut down any conversation or negotiation for change. And for the most part, we leave suffering to those who are not voluntarily suffering, but who have no choice in the matter. You know, I'm a big fan of King. I think his method is absolutely tremendous. It transformed this country. And I can't help but wonder, what would King do in this age, 50 years on? Right? In an age of social media, of memes, of 24-hour news cycle, when racism has gone kind of underground and it's subtle and unconscious in even the best of people. So I ask myself this, what would King do? I can tell you this, he'd piss off a lot of people. And how do I know this? Because at the height of his notoriety, in 1966, the year I was born, 2/3 of the nation, 66%, disapproved of him and his tactics. Right? He's now named as one of the most influential men of the 21st century, and certainly here in the United States. Because as much as his movement was peaceful and nonviolent from his point of view, his movement was also surrounded by horrific, bloody violence. And people called him agitator and instigator. People wanted to blame him for the violence. But he kept pushing. He knew he was walking into situations where violence was bound to happen. No doubt about it. In fact, he somewhat counted on it, because he knew the only way to help white America understand what black America understood, what black America was going through, how they were treated, was to show them. And a lot of people were hurt. A lot of people were shamed into doing the right thing as well by seeing those innocents hurt, that voluntary suffering. And it angers me that people wanted to blame King, right? He knew violence would happen, but he didn't do it. The perpetrators had the choice. And that was ultimately their downfall. So it kind of amuses me in this day and age, right, that people often speak out against Black Lives Matter. Their tactics are annoying, even rude at times, but they don't go to incite violence. They too believe in nonviolent means, but they are as unpopular as King was with most of white America. And their goal is the same as King's, to open our eyes to the suffering of our Black brothers and sisters, whether they're gay or straight, transgender or cisgender. And the question is, are we going to listen? Black Lives Matter is not the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, nor are they organized the same way. And I don't want to say that they're the same as King, but I hope my point is clear. Their unpopularity may be because they're making each of us take a long, hard look at racism in this country. And we kind of hoped it was over, but involuntary suffering keeps going on. So what do? How can we apply King's 6 principles and steps to this modern day in our modern ills? Well, some people have put this in different ways. One of the first things is don't dehumanize others. It's just so easy to dehumanize, right? It's this insidious thing that we do, from making fun of people's physical attributes to reducing people to stereotypes or name-calling. One of my favorite people talks a lot about this, and you've heard me speak about her before, is Brene Brown. She's a modern-day speaker of truth to power and believes that social media, due to its anonymous nature, is one of the primary platforms of our dehumanizing behavior. In this wonderful book, her newest book, she writes this: if you are offended or hurt when you hear Hillary Clinton or Maxine Walters called a bitch, whore, or the C word, you should be equally offended and hurt when you hear those same words used to describe Ivanka Trump, Kellyanne Conway, or Theresa May. If you felt belittled when Hillary Clinton called Trump supporters a basket of deplorables, then you should have felt equally concerned when Eric Trump said, Democrats aren't even human. When the President of the United States calls women dogs or talks about grabbing pussy, we should get chills down our spine and resistance flowing through our veins. When people call the President of the United States a pig, we should reject that language regardless of our politics and demand discourse that doesn't make people subhuman. When we hear people referred to as animals or aliens, we should immediately wonder, is this an attempt to reduce someone's humanity so we can get away with hurting them or denying them basic human rights? If you are offended by a meme of Trump photoshopped to look like Hitler, then you shouldn't have Obama photoshopped to look like the Joker on your Facebook feed. She continues, there's a line, it's etched from dignity, and raging, fearful people from the right and left are crossing it in unprecedented rates every single day. We must never tolerate dehumanization, the primary instrument of violence that has been used in every genocide recorded throughout history. When we engage in dehumanizing rhetoric or promote dehumanizing images, we diminish our own humanity in the process. When we reduce Muslim people to terrorists or Mexicans to illegals or police officers to pigs, it says nothing at all about the people we are attacking. It does say volumes about who we are and the degree to which we are operating in our integrity. I think King would have liked Brene. King believed that humiliating others was the road to more violence, that to get to the beloved community, we needed compassion and education. We need to get people into their hearts. So the second thing that we can do is to rehumanize. I think that's part of what King was talking about educating others and this involuntary suffering, is to rehumanize people who have been dehumanized for so long. And how does this work? Well, let me give you an example of rehumanization. I've already sworn a lot here. I'm reading someone else's words, so I apologize for some of them. the crude words that I've said, I'm not going to repeat the one the president has used in the last few days to describe some other countries. He said some very dehumanizing words about those countries that are poor and struggling, and the words were racist. That is, they're dehumanizing people based on where they were from. And in this case, most from poor countries with poor people of color. People who are poor, mostly because of the colonization from European countries and America, but that's a whole other sermon. Okay, how do you respond? Because this is infuriating. I mean, it gets the blood boiling, like, really? Really? How does one go about educating? To me, it doesn't move us. You know, the problem is like, so activists right now, they're projecting the word he used onto his hotels at night. Now, it's funny, right? Right? How is that helping? How's that educating? To me, it doesn't move us anywhere. It's like having a shouting match. Oh, yeah, well, you are. No, you are. But here's, a New York bookstore did this. I think it's really hilarious. So this is great. This is a picture of a table in a bookstore with all these wonderful authors from different countries that he was belittling. And I love this because using humor and intelligence and grace, they're educating others and rehumanizing people from these countries. That's what we need to do. You know, speaking truth to power is not about humiliating or belittling. It's about humanizing the problem. It's about listening and educating, and it's about reaching people's hearts, not just their heads. And I do challenge you in the weeks to come, especially if you're on social media in particular, is notice what's humanizing or dehumanizing about what's posted. And see if you can speak with power, in love, in response. And I'll give you an example of something that I did. So, this was not social media. This was actually, I think it was somewhere in my first year here. And I was joining Reverend Sarah Halverson, who is part of CLUE, which is this Clergy and Laity United for Economic Justice. And there was a huge protest against El Super, which is a it's a grocery store that caters to the Hispanic community. And there was a lot of, the unions were protesting because of bad wages and lack of benefits and that other stores had, and El Super was not giving it to them. And so they've been doing this for a while, and so I've never done this before, and Sarah invited me along, and she said, well, so what we do is we go up there and we protest a little while outside of the El Super, and then we have this letter that we marched over to the manager's office and we hand him the letter. And then we say a prayer. And I thought, okay, fine. So I went along, and we did all of that. We go up to the manager, who's obviously, you know, a little defensive, as we're there. And Sarah hands him the letter and sort of just says, you know, would you please read this letter when you get a chance and hand it up to the powers that be? And oh, yeah, okay. And oh, do you mind if we say a prayer? And I'm like, okay. And I thought, you know, no. I have to do a little bit something more here. This is all really lovely and it's really nice and everything like that. So I said, you know, excuse me, but do you attend church? Yeah, I go to this, I was a Catholic church somewhere up the street. I said, oh, okay. So what does your faith teach you about how to treat others? I don't want to talk about religion. I can understand that, but I invite you next time you're in church to ask, what would Jesus do? I simply wanted to ask him to live his Christian values, because I know that church. It's a wonderful church, and they do ask people to live their Christian values. Now, I have no idea if that changed anything. I do know that they came to an agreement eventually. But I like to think that when next time he sat in church, he was thinking. And that's part of what we do, is just gently. I mean, I didn't want to belittle him. I didn't want to, but I'm okay with making him feel a little uncomfortable. You know, he should feel uncomfortable. he's a manager and not treating his people well. Because how many people do you know have their minds changed after being humiliated, belittled, or yelled at? And there are stories about people turning even a little because they were treated humanely and respectfully and encouraged to be better. If we want reconciliation, we have to choose a different path than the one we are on now in this nation. Because memes and name-calling, it's just not working. You know, we don't have to take our cues from our president. You know, Ruby Bridges knew this. She respectfully called them out for their behavior, and it did stop. King lovingly called white America out on its behavior, and much of it stopped. If we're going to change the world, each of us is going to need to lead from that same place, that same kind of love. I wish for all of you to lead with love. Blessed be, and amen.
This is a new song. It was written the day after Trump was elected by Melanie Moore. And I think it's good practice for us. Saturdays, those Women's March, I hope a lot of you are going to go. The church is going to have a contingent there. So this will be a little practice for that. So please stand as you're comfortable. And either march in place or march with your hands on your thighs if that's easier for you. You gotta put one foot in front of the other and lead with love. Put one foot in front of the other and lead with love. You gotta put one foot in front of the other and lead with love. Put one foot in front of the other and lead with love. Don't give up hope. Don't give up hope. You're not alone. You're not alone. Don't you give up. Don't you give up. Keep moving on. Keep moving on. You gotta put one foot in front of the other and lead with love. Put one foot in front of the other and lead with love. You gotta put one foot in front of the other and lead with love. Put one foot in front of the other and lead with love. Lift up your eyes. Lift up your eyes. Don't you despair. Don't you despair. Look up ahead. Look up ahead. The path is there. The path is there. You gotta put one foot in front of the other and lead with love. Put one foot in front of the other and lead with love. You gotta put one foot in front of the other and lead with love. Put one foot in front of the other and lead with love. I know you're scared. I know you're scared. I'm scared too. I'm scared too. But here I am. But here I am. Right next to you. Right next to you. You gotta put one foot in front of the other and lead with love. Put one foot in front of the other and lead with love. You gotta put one foot in front of the other and lead with love. Put one foot in front of the other and lead with love.
We come from a tradition where all our ministries here at Orange Coast Unitarian Universalist Church are supported by members and friends. Their time, their treasure, and their talent. And for all the ways you give, we are grateful. As part of our offering, each month we share half of our loose cash and undesignated checks we receive with an organization that shares our values. And this month it is Stand Up for Kids in Orange County, which serves homeless and at-risk youth and young adults, including victims of abuse or neglect. LGBTQ youth, kids with disabilities, and kids forced out of their homes. We can read programs that include street outreach, a drop-in center, school-based prevention, and housing support. So we ask you to give gracefully to this organization as well as this church. For our bounty and the many ways we give by singing this song.
Now is that time when we get to honor what's in our hearts. It's this ritual we call joys and sorrows, and you are invited one and all, whether you're a member, a friend, or a visitor, to participate. It's really quite simple. It's about lighting candles, and if you'd like to share a profound joy or sorrow out loud, you can write it on a piece of paper that you were given when you came in here. This is Judith Stamper, one of our wonderful pastoral care associates, and she'll be helping me today. I invite you to come forward to light a candle in honor of that deep joy or sorrow. If you'd like to share it, hand me your joy or sorrow and we'll read them out loud. Dan Noel has lit a candle because he's downsizing. He's leaving the house he started to occupy in 1992 with his first wife and children.
From William Tennell, a candle of sorrow for Henry, who was lost at sea yesterday and beloved by so many.
There's a lot of sadness today. Jamie and Jazzy Pendarvis lit a candle of sorrow for the passing of their dear friend, Jeannie. She was wonderful, sweet, and funny. She will be missed by us and all that knew her.
Tom Lockery lit a candle of joy. He says, "Thank you for so many of you being part of the memorial service yesterday for my dad. A special thanks to our wonderful staff for all the help, assistance, and guidance. The music, the service, and being together was very special. Thank you."
And Judith here has a candle of both joy and sorrow. She says, "My son Marshall moved to Taiwan last week. My house is much too quiet, but I admire his adventurous spirit."
And from Don and Sandy Martin, the Reverend Betts Weineke died on December 28th. We're heartbroken at the loss of our dear friend.
And most of you got the email that was sent out last week. I know, but if you haven't read your email, I am sorry to report that Maurice Giss passed away last week. Marilyn and Darren are devastated, obviously. Maurice was a big part of this beloved community, loved by so many. We will be having a celebration of his life here at the church sometime in the future, so I'll be informing you about that at that time.
I have two messages about Maurice. One is anonymous and one is from Deborah Kwan, just saying that the loss of our beloved friend Maurice Giss, who passed away. We hold Marilyn and Darren and all of his family in our thoughts and prayers.
And the last one is to let you know of another difficult situation going on in the congregation. Many of you know Mary Smithberger and that she broke her shoulder a while back. It was a terrible break. Unfortunately, she's also gotten another terrible diagnosis. It's a life-threatening form and aggressive form of throat cancer. She's asked me to let you inform her she's created what we're calling Team Mary here at the church. She's doing everything right and putting all of what she needs in order, although we're very hopeful for the outcome. You know, the choir sang "We're in this together" earlier. It applies to justice and it applies here in churches too, on the intimate forms of our lives when we're stricken. We've got a lot of people who are helping out, but for the next 8 weeks she's going to have intensive radiation and chemotherapy. And we're organizing rides and all sorts of kinds of support and visits, and if you can help, please see the caring table. We've got a good team together, or you can come be part of that team. She even has a little token for every person who's part of the team. So thank you all.
Let us hold in love all the joys and celebrations and all the hurts and sadness, both spoken and silent. Let our joys remind us to be thankful, our concerns remind us to hope, and our sorrows remind us to connect. Let all these moments remind us that we are not alone.
There's a lot of sadness in today's joys and sorrows. It isn't always that way. If you're new here, it isn't always that way. Sometimes we're overwhelmed with all the joyful things. But there's a lot of loss going on right now in our congregation and in the world. We've got people here facing loss of loved ones and life-threatening diagnoses, the loss of minds. And then there's news of the sad stories of innocents out there in the news being hurt and frightened about their future. And of course we've got environmental devastations, right? We've had fires and floods and this terrible flu that's going around. It just seems to me like there's all this sadness weighing. So this morning for our prayer, I just invite you to feel that sadness if that's how you feel. And if you don't, great, I invite you to hold those here who are feeling that sadness. Because this beloved community is big enough and loving enough to hold that sadness. So please join me in silence as we bow our heads. I'm so grateful for this community and all the way that it loves and supports one another. Thank you. And amen.
Let us join together as we extinguish the flame of our chalice.
Extinguish our chalice, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again.
Thank you all for worshiping with us today. Your presence makes all the difference. Before we leave this service for a coffee and companionship, I'd like to take a moment to welcome any guests or visitors that we have here today. If you are a guest, a visitor, or someone who hasn't been known to this community, I invite you to stand just for a brief moment, or raise your hand. Simply tell us your name and where you're from.
Susan and John Baird, and I'm the sister of Nancy Lawbury.
Hi everybody, I'm Kathleen and I'm from Los Angeles.
I'm Gianna Morrison, I'm from Irvine.
I'm Diana Hayes and I just moved to Huntington Beach from Santa Rosa, California. We lost our home in the fire, so we are opening to a new community.
Hi, I'm Bill Fennell. I'm a recent transplant from Connecticut.
Church, we just moved to Costa Mesa.
We're always blessed by having visitors, guests, and friends to join us, and we hope that they find a spiritual home here. If anyone has a question about Unitarian Universalism or how to get involved, please stop by the welcome table. The folks there can assist in connecting you to the congregation, from ways to meet people to getting signed up for our weekly email. Reverend Sean is also available to meet people with any questions that you may have. We love to have everyone feel a part of this community, so please reach out and we'll extend our hand back to you. Now would be that time you can turn on your cell phones. We invite you to tweet, Facebook, or text anything about this service that you found inspiring.
And of course, we're not done until we've seen our announcements. So these are all the wonderful ways that we do church throughout the week. Lots of different things going on. We've got the LGBT Action Group meeting today and our nonfiction book club. And of course, you can sign up for the Women's March. And Sarah Hunter, where are you? There's Sarah over there. So, and Bernie and Sarah are helping organize, what do you call it, ride shares?
And Sunny Harbor.
And Sunny Harbor.
Or a meeting place.
Or a meeting place, yeah. So some people are thinking of meeting here and then carpooling over, that kind of thing. So I think there's a sign-up sheet, or talk to Sarah or Bertie, and we'll get you all connected for the Women's March.
I have a sheet out there for you.
Okay,
all.
Sarah.
Okay, good.
There we go. We're set. So next Saturday is the Women's March in the morning. Please come all out for that. We've got our also other things. We've got also a new class starting next Sunday at 2 o'clock. Maureen is going to be teaching a class on CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, which is a great way if you want to change a behavior in your life. It's a great thing. This is not going to be group therapy, but she's going to teach you the tools to help you change something that you might like to change in your life. And then also on Saturday the 24th, Dave Carlson is going to teach a class on how to prevent falls. And this is particularly for a certain population here. There may be a reason for you might want to come out for that.
The Saturday's not the 24th.
Oh, okay, sorry, whatever that's
So
the
that's-
next Saturday.
It'll be the 27th.
Sorry, 27th, thank you. My bad, I don't know what I'm looking at. It was a long day yesterday. So thank you for noticing that, I appreciate that. You'll see information in our blast. That's what we call our weekly email that goes out with lots of details about everything that's going on in the church. If you'd like to sign up for that, please see the welcome table out here. That's a table with the blue tablecloth, and they'll get you signed up for that. It's a great way to know about what's going on here. And for those of you who don't read your email, read it. So I want to let you know, leave you with these words by Martin Luther King. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. And hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. This service is over, let our service continue. Thank you.